yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
In Rossville, Georgia, they heard the news, and they heard the call. America's entrance into World War II would mean everyone would be part of the fight. Soldiers, sailors, and Marines would be the front-line combatants, but those back home would have their part to do as well. For a generation, Peerless Woolen Mills created fabric and clothing items from wool. Since its creation in 1905, the mill had employed thousands and produced more woolen fabric than any other mill of its type in the United States. But just like other factories and mills across the nation, the Peerless mission would now change. In the North, factories that once churned out shiny new Fords and Chevrolets were now manufacturing Jeeps and fighter planes. Tanks rolled off assembly lines in the Midwest, and bombers were being built on both coasts. Likewise, Peerless was granted a contract from the U.S. government to make blankets for the Army and the Navy, and wool fabric for uniforms, particularly those warm pea coats for the Navy. Production ramped up in early 1942 as nearly 1,000 additional workers were hired to keep up with the demands of the military. At the peak, more than 3,000 people labored to produce and ship much-needed textiles to those fighting on foreign shores. On average, more than 33,000 blankets were shipped daily from the docks in Rossville. Ultimately, millions of yards of fabric would be created in the name of victory.
The tall man with a hard hat and a whiskers on his chin will soon be knocking at your door, and you ought to be in. The tall man with the high hat will be coming down your way. Get your savings out when you hear him shout, "Any bonds today?" Come on and get 'em, folks. Come on, skip right up and get 'em.
As soon as Peerless began servicing the government contract, the employees were asked to give more than just the sweat of their brow. Just like in other places of business, employees were urged to take a more personal and more financial part in the war effort. Posters like these were hung all around the physical plant, informing workers that the government needed all the help they, the workers, could give. In this April 1942 issue of the Peerless News, the bold plan to buy a bomber is announced. At today's prices, it doesn't seem likely that a bunch of mill workers could ever afford to buy such a piece of equipment, but the price tag for this one was just $240,000. Workers were asked to buy war bonds and stamps, the proceeds of which would go to the purchase of a P-47 bomber. Committees were formed and departments were pitted against one another in a good-natured competition. Goal tallies were posted in each department near the thermometer. Each department and each shift in each department tried to outdo the others in the amount of money raised. Times were tight, but the employees of Peerless not only bought the bomber, they bought two. And in a little more than a year, Clyde Liner, who worked at the credit union, got a letter from Sergeant R.V. Strickland, dated September 1st, 1943. It reads in part,
"Dear Sir, I had a great thrill today and was very proud when I saw the P-47 named Peerless City of Rossville, Georgia. Although I'm a mechanic on the Flying Fortress, the pursuit sure looks swell to me. I know the people gave up a considerable amount of things to buy bonds enough to help pay for this ship. I'm a former citizen of North Georgia, and I know many people around Rossville. I'm a resident of Chattanooga now, East Lake."
He finished by saying,
"We thank you all from the depth of our hearts for everything, and we are certainly proud of that P-47. We depend on it to bring our forts back home. Truly thankful, Sergeant R.V. Strickland."
In addition to the pride of having supplied a critical aircraft to the war effort, John L. Hutchison saw to it that his employees were financially rewarded as well. Because every employee had contributed to the bond sale, he announced that there would be a bonus of 10% for each employee as a thank you for their efforts. That one decision cost the company $115,000. Bonuses were uncommon during the war, but Peerless was known for taking care of its own. The second bomber bought with bonds would eventually complete 46 missions in the European theater. It was on its 47th mission over Germany that the B-25 Mitchell was shot down. Durwood Seas, the son of a Peerless employee, was a member of the crew, but was thankfully not on board when it was lost. Peerless employees didn't send only their money and products to fight the war, they sent their flesh and blood. Workers and their families joined the service in large numbers. Periodically, names of the volunteers would be listed in the Peerless News. One such volunteer was Private Johnny Winifred Lancaster. She joined the WACS, or Women's Army Corps, and trained right down the road in Fort Oglethorpe. Lancaster played softball for the state championship softball team, the Woolenettes. She was eventually stationed at the Air Transport Command in West Palm Beach, Florida. She was joined by fellow team member Henry Louise Trundle, whose brother-in-law had been killed in action in France just a few weeks before her joining. Another example of how the Peerless family took care of its own, this letter, one of hundreds sent out twice a year, letting Smith Walker of Chickamauga know that he was still receiving bonus checks even though he was off fighting the war. The letter reads,
"We feel that you boys who are giving up so much for the benefit of all of us should share in this bonus. All your friends here at the mill are putting in 6 and 7 days work a week and, of course, doing everything possible to keep it going like it was when you were here. So far, 400 of our boys have gone in the service. You can readily see how much we miss them, but somehow or other, we will keep it rolling until you come back and take your old jobs over."
It continues,
"We all miss you and hope this check comes in handy. Have a big time and remember your friends back here at Peerless who made it possible for you. Good luck and our best wishes. Sincerely yours, John L. Hutchison, Jr."
The letters flowed in both directions. John L. often heard from his employees as they moved around the globe. Often, those letters were published in the Peerless News for the reading enjoyment of those at the mill. One from Elmer Ellis reads,
"Dear Sir, would like to write a few lines to show my appreciation for the nice bonus check and also for making it possible for me to get the Peerless News. I'm sure looking forward to the day when I can once more be back in dear old Rossville. Right now, it would be sweet music to hear the Peerless Mill whistle blow instead of the sergeant's whistle."
I've got my fare, and just a trifle to spare.
Sometimes the news from the front wasn't good. Here, the mill uses the news of one of their own being killed in action to urge employees to buy even more war bonds and stamps. Meanwhile, back at the home front, even more sacrifice is suggested.
Mother, where are our stockings?
Children, come and sit down a minute. Ginny, this is for you. And Billy, this is for you. It's Mother's Christmas present.
War bonds.
Yes, darling, war bonds.
Well, gee, thanks a lot, Mom, but
I wanted a bicycle.
I know you did, Ginny. And I know that Billy wanted a railroad. But I feel that you're both old enough to realize that your country's at war and to be willing to make sacrifices for it.
In addition to working hard and buying bonds, it was up to those left behind to conserve resources so that material necessary to fight could be used for the war effort. Employees and their families were constantly reminded to take care of the things they had because replacements might not be available later. Our fighting forces roll on rubber, this article states. It is needed for fighter planes, bombers, battleships, gas masks, and medical equipment. Most of the U.S. supply of rubber came from the Far East, and that supply was cut off by the Japanese early in the conflict. The story continues, household rubber in its many uses, rubberized garments such as raincoats, galoshes, and babies' equipment must be carefully cared for. Scrapping became an important part of home life as civilians were asked to turn into the government items such as paper, old rags, scrap metal, and old rubber so that it could be recycled into items for the military. Everyone was asked to go through their house, yard, and business to find old pieces of metal such as pipes, cans, sinks, and appliances, then call the WPA for pickup. Recycling wasn't the only method of making sure the military had everything it needed to fight. Rationing was also introduced.
You see, the ration points are designed to make sure that in these times of shortages, everyone gets their fair share. But more importantly, they make sure that our boys overseas get 3 squares a day. After all, hungry GIs don't win wars. Let's see what else you have. Now that's also a food ration coupon, but in this case, it's for dried and processed foods. In many ways, processed and dried foods are the best value for your dollar. They have a shelf life that's practically infinite. That means less waste due to spoilage. And as we all know, waste puts victory right into the hands of the Krauts.
Civilians were issued ration books and stamps. Items like gasoline, tires, even sugar were rationed. Nylons and chocolate were hard to get as well. The war effort took far more than just soldiers and tanks. It took the cooperation of every American citizen, and those who worked at the Peerless Mill gave their full measure of support to the effort. Along the way to victory, the workers at Peerless set and broke production records, and the military noticed. The Undersecretary of War, Robert Patterson, bestowed the Army-Navy Production Award twice in 1 year to the employees of the Peerless Woolen Mill. The company was recognized for going above and beyond the call of duty in producing needed materials for the armed forces. As the war progressed, pride and community weren't the only tools used to sell war bonds. Peerless employees were exposed to the ugliness of war in an effort to cajole them into buying more bonds than ever before. Guilt was an effective method of selling bonds as purchases increased throughout the conflict. While the business of war was mostly serious, Peerless employees also found time to celebrate the fruits of their labor. Dances, concerts, and the yearly staple Christmas party continued to keep spirits high back home. From late 1941 until victory in 1945, workers produced more than 11 million wool blankets for our troops and weaved more than 12 million yards of uniform fabric. This was the most of any mill in the United States, and certainly a point of pride for the workers of the Peerless.